The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the individual participants and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any organization. The participants are expressing their personal opinions and perspectives. This is episode 183. I'm Tommy Serafinski, and you're listening to the Conservation and Science podcast, where we take a deep dive into topics of ecology, conservation, and human-wildlife conflict. And I want to start with a big shout-out to everybody who so far bought me a coffee on buymeacoffee.com/Tommy'sOutdoors. This is great help. I greatly appreciate your support, so big thank you. Those coffees are really important because I am editing those episodes on a very early hours every morning. I starting my day at my alarm clock goes at 4:55 every day, except the weekends where its start is 4:30. Why it's earlier in the weekends, that's a different story. But anyway, those coffees are very important because doing these podcasts, making those podcasts early in the morning is the only way I can keep doing them and have a 9-to-5 job and have a somehow something that resembles normal life with family and hobbies, etc., etc. But today I want to give a special shout outs to 3 new members on Buy Me a Coffee: Emmanuel, Phelim, and Gavin. And what membership is basically commitment for supporting of the podcast either monthly or annually. And this is great help. And so thank you folks for that. And if you would like to become a member on Tommy's Outdoors little community on Buy Me a Coffee, then link is in the description of the show. And why would you do that? Well, for one, you will get a shout out, but there is more. You will get an exclusive members only posts where I will give you an updates on what episodes are coming, what am I working on, maybe some behind the scenes photos if something interesting is going on. But that's not all. You will get either free or heavily discounted seats on the online or in real life events that I'm doing. Like, for example, Intellect salons, or maybe like the talk that I was doing last year about consuming meat and being environmentally friendly. So you will get the discounts or even free seats as well as a member on Buy Me a Coffee. And finally, you will get a free access to exclusive series of episodes that I'm putting out every now and then. Those series of episodes are usually paywalled, but if you're a member on Buy Me a Coffee, then you will get them for free. So if you want to support me and this podcast and ensure that I will keep making those episodes, then the best way to do that is to become a member on Buy Me a Coffee. The link is in the description of the show, buymeacoffee.com/Tommy'sOutdoors. Click on the membership and select the membership level that suits your needs and level at which you want to support me, and become a member. So thank you for that. Now, having that out of the way, let's talk about today's episode. Our guest today is Bill O'Keeffe, who is a dairy farmer in County Kilkenny. And that was interesting how that episode came to be because Bill is a listener of a podcast. Bill is with me, or with us, should I say, part of that community for quite a while. And Bill contacted me after one of the episodes that I published, and he went like, well, that's not the full picture, let's say. And it's easy to get a hold of me. As you know, you can reach me on social media or maybe through my newsletter. And I said like, hey, great to hear from you. Maybe we get on call. And sure enough, later that day, we got on call and we start talking. And quickly, we get on the subject of nature restoration law. And as you know, I was talking about nature restoration law quite a lot. It's a big deal. And I was uncomfortable and I couldn't understand why farmers seemed to be the only group who were opposing nature restoration law. It didn't make any sense to me. And I was trying to dig deeper and understand why it is happening. And I couldn't. I never got from any of the farmers that I know and I talked about, I either never got like a detailed answer why, Or sometimes those who were members of farming organizations, they were just straight up like, well, I shouldn't be talking about that because that's like an organizational thing. So I didn't get anywhere there as well. So having the opportunity, having Bill on the call, and Bill is involved in IFA, it's Irish Farmers Association. And so I go, hey, Bill, like just tell me about this nature restoration law. What's up with that? And we start talking about that. And that was eye-opening to an extent. And then I said, Bill, would you talk to me about this on the podcast? And he immediately said yes. And I think it's a big deal. And why I think it's a big deal. I do those episodes for a number of years, 5-6 years. And I made a lot of episodes with members of environmental NGOs and some other governmental organizations, or maybe some officers in the EU. And it is always a process of like, oh, I need to check that with, or I need to clear that with our public relation department or communications unit or something like that. There's some sort of a sign-off. So I expected Bill going through the same process, and yet he immediately said yes. And I think it's a big deal because that speaks to the level of honesty and openness about those issues. And so a couple of weeks later, I was on my way to Bill's farm. And obviously, as you know, this was not the first episode I recorded with a farmer on their farm. And Bill did what all the farmers do, men and women. He walked me around his farm first, showed me his livestock, showed me his fields, and so on and so forth. And that is happening every time you go on a farm. Farmers are just proud on what they do, and they're proud about their farms. Except this time, I was prepared. And while we were walking on a farm, we recorded a video from the farm. Now, I will strive to publish that video at the same time as I'm publishing this episode on my YouTube channel. However, if you're listening to this podcast or watching it, and on my YouTube channel that video is still not there, well, subscribe so you don't miss it, and it will be there in the next couple of days. I will try to publish it at the same time, I promise, but that's a lot of editing in 1 week, so I might slip a couple of days, okay? So, yeah, I hope you will enjoy this episode. And just by the way, if you're a farmer who are listening to this and you think like, oh, that would be cool to have a video made on my farm, give me a shout. Maybe it's going to be a YouTube series, something like Tommy on the Farm or something along these lines. So give me a shout if you like it. And as always on YouTube, leave the comments. Comments are a great thing for YouTube videos to get the reach and so on and so forth. With all this out of the way, in this episode, we are going to talk mainly about nature restoration law, and also we're going to talk about a few other things related to farming. We're going to talk about public discourse, especially on social media, related to farming, how to handle that, and what's going on in there. Now, I said that Bill is involved in IFA, but obviously I was talking with Bill in a personal capacity. And in this episode, you will hear a disclaimer. And that disclaimer is, on one hand, standard thing. And also, just in case there's like some internet troll, someone who thinks that they're smarter than they really are and will try to, kick up dust. So that's a standard thing. So remember that my conversation with Bill was totally personal. And I was speaking with Bill as a private person. However, we spoke about stuff that's going on in IFA and about lobbying and about all those things as well. So I think that introduction is long enough. Ladies and gentlemen, Bill O'Keeffe. Bill, hello. How are you?
Good, Tommy. Very good. And you're very welcome to the farm here in Clara, County Kilkenny.
Perfect. Like, lads, for you who tuning in and listening to this podcast, I had a tour of the farm. Bill walked me through all the interesting places and showed me, farming practices and the biodiversity and everything. And there's going to be probably 2 parts material on my YouTube channel from this walk around the farm. So folks, tune into that video on the YouTube channel. But now for this podcast, Bill, like you said, we are on a dairy farm, County Kilkenny. Thank you for the invitation. That's a whole story how I got into here. For the folks who are only listening to this, can you paint the picture? Where are we? Like how your operations looks like? A little bit of an introduction to yourself as well.
Yeah, so I suppose I'm home farming 25 years now. Would have come back to a family farm. There's a lot of history in the area. I suppose we're here farming since the 1600s. We're milking cows for hundreds of years here on the site. Would have been supplying milk to Kilkenny Creamery back in 1916, as far back as that, and probably before that, but that's the first official record. And it's very much family orientated. There's 3 generations on the farm today. When you were on the farm, my son and my dad were both there doing jobs on the farm today. And I suppose that's a big thing of what we see as important to us is continuing on with that. And you talk about sustainability, and that's the real definition of sustainability. It's carrying on the next generation and trying to keep everything in a good stead for the next generation, and trying to carry on what traditions have been here over the years on the farm. So look, we're milking 400 cows, Tommy. I suppose there's no point in shying away from that because it is a sizable dairy operation. We're in derogation. We're not up at the upper limit. We're not that heavily stocked. We're very self-sufficient in terms of feed. Probably have a more robust, sustainable breed of cow than some farmers would have. And we're comfortable with that system, and we're comfortable enough in our skin. And we would have left a lot of trees and hedgerows and corners of biodiversity. We have a stream flowing down to the farm that we try to look after as best we can. We would have planted a lot of trees across the generations on the farm, really. Sometimes non-natives like beech trees and horse chestnuts, and even more, different varieties of trees. But we'd be trying to move back towards oak. Unfortunately, the ash is going to go on the whitethorn, holly, those kind of trees that we're working with a lot now. And willow trees and birch trees, we're putting in a good few of those now lately as well. So that's what we're about. We're trying to maintain the environment, make a living from the farm, and try and leave the ground as good as we got it, and probably improve the likes of soil structure, biodiversity. I would say over maybe between my father's generation and mine, some of the advice that we would have gotten on how to farm and some policy would have driven the farm in different directions has been more efficient and maybe less environmentally friendly. And it's probably trying to bring us around to that circle now, and making the farm more sustainable and more environmentally friendly now. And look, we often get challenged on that, and you hear about greenwashing and it's a green desert out there. That's what I would have said to you, and I say that to a lot of people at maybe challenges on social media. Come out and have a look at the farm and see what we're actually doing on the farm. We've had the likes of Malcolm Noonan, the Green Party minister, out on the farm, and I think he liked what he saw. And there's a lot of culture and heritage here as well, and that he's the minister for that. And yeah, we'd like to think we're looking after the countryside, and we're custodians of the countryside and looking after it as best we can. I do a bit of fishing and a bit of hunting and that as well, and I suppose the biodiversity is important to me from that reason as well.
And just I think another thing for folks, you are a listener of a podcast, so it's like, oh yeah, you sort of like being promoted in their quotes from just a listener. Now you're a guest, and you're like I would consider a high profile guest because you're also involved in IFA.
Yeah, I am chair of the National Farm Business Committee in the IFA, so we'd have responsibility for working with the banks, with taxation, with the government, the likes of the MEP elections, trying to decide on policy and what we're looking to lobby the likes of MEPs for going out to Brussels occasionally. And we'll have a chat now with the Minister for Agriculture coming up to the budget. We'll have some asks, and I suppose we try and put our document together for lobbying the politicians coming up to the likes of a budget and the likes of an election. So we'll have both this year. We've had the local and European elections already. We've been busy enough at that. Now we have a budget brought forward a week to the 1st of October, so we have a document ready for that. And we'll work on the general election, which will probably take place over the coming months, over the later months of the year. We're not definite on that yet. So yeah, it's a busy enough role. We're representing farmers, and it's nice to be given the opportunity to represent farmers on the likes of your podcast. I do listen very regularly to the podcast, try and pick up on as many episodes as possible. When you're working on the farm, there's a good opportunity. It could be milking cows or checking stock, or even just driving to the out farm where we went today to see the calves, and just 30 minutes there we can just stick on a podcast on the phone and listen to it. And while it's nice to listen to birdsong and everything and the noises out in the fields every day, it's nice to be able to maybe educate yourself a bit as you go as well.
Thank you for that. So I am really happy that you invited me here, and I was, you already sort of done the thing that I was going to ask you about, but I'm curious, conscious of our listeners. I was described proudly by one of the farmers as that I was always good with farmers, and I'm kind of like proud of that I was described as a good with farmers. And I even if I'm out hunting, I'm meeting farmers, and there's like always 99.9% is a good experience. Now, in a recent weeks, months, maybe, when the nature restoration law was in the making, let's say, there was a farmer protests around Europe, really, and I don't want to go into the details of farmers' protests because apparently there were different things in different countries, right? But we saw, nothing short of riots in Brussels and the tires burning and all those things, and then you hear the information about pesticide use regulations were loosened. Farmers seem to be the only group that was against nature restoration law. And then you obviously hear the climate change denial aspects of it. And I started to feel like, I was talking to my friend and I said to him, there's like a little part of me that goes like, God, I hate farmers. But that's not true, obviously, right? So could you please help me reconcile that?
There's a lot going on in that question, Tommy.
Yes, but I know.
We'll come back to it. And just on the protest, we happened to be out in Brussels on a tour with our Farm Business Committee, and there was a protest on. So we got involved in a protest, a very peaceful protest. We had most of the Irish MEPs come out and met us and actually spoke to us outside the Parliament in Brussels. And there's a lot of young farmers groups came to meet at that stage as well. So all the protest did get very serious afterwards. Look, nature restoration and the pesticides directive, they mean different things in different countries. And the first thing I'd say on the farm here, from a pesticide point of view, if we were going to reseed a field, we may use some Roundup to clean up the old sward, and we'll put in new swards. It could be multi-species. You have to get rid of all the existing weeds and plant new weeds, really, is chicory and plantain and clover, and you're putting in your grass. So that's about as much as we use. We might use a small bit of broadleafed weed killer selectively if there's too many docks or thistles across a paddock, and if they're hitting production, we'll go around and spot spray those. But we use very, very little pesticides. It's herbicides we'd use. We'd never use an insecticide or a fungicide on a grassland farm in Ireland. So just from that point of view, it's the tillage farmers and horticulture farmers, and we hear and they're more than entitled to use them. They're safe to use. They have their you have to use it a certain amount of time before harvest and everything else like that. So we often hear that cows are bad and pesticides are bad, but cows grazing grass in an Irish farm use very, very little pesticides, and in fact all they use is herbicides. So it's just an interesting point of view. From the nature restoration law, yeah, look, it was the impact of it was assessed from an environmental point of view, and that was all. It was done out in Europe at the time, right? And it has to be done individually from each country now as we put our plan in place for nature restoration within the country. We were to go back to the 1950s, the state that the country was in the 1950s with ground. Now, there's been a lot of drainage. There's been roads built, there's been infrastructure developments, there's been housing, there's been everything built since then. Farms have been drained, farms have been cleared from furze and rushes and different things and brought into good heart, as we'd call it, or good production and profitable production for agriculture. Now that can still be done in a sustainable way. We heard a lot about re-wetting and the targets for re-wetting and the amount of the peatlands that were to be re-wetted. We have a lot of our members in the IFA that are farming those tougher farms at the edge of peat grounds where they've drained it and they've improved it over the years. They obviously don't want to see that going back to an unproductive state, right? And we'd be very worried. We have plenty of food security in Ireland. We do import food. We export a lot of food. We export a lot of beef and dairy. But I think people that have never been hungry in their lives don't appreciate what food security is for the rest of the world. We do export a lot of high-value proteins to other countries, and infant formula, beef, burgers, everything else, all the cheaper cuts as well as the dearer cuts of meat. and all the different dairy products. I think we have to take cognizance of that we do need nature restoration. We need to improve biodiversity. We do need to improve nature, but we need to do it beside farming. And to me, like, farmers are out in the countryside, and I've met environmentalists who talk all the time about improving biodiversity, but never speak to farmers. And we were out on the farm today, and I pointed to a section of ground and said, that's not that productive. I'd love to put in a pond there. It cost me, a few €1,000 to do a cheap job. You'd be talking about spending more if you wanted to fence it properly away and maybe plant a few trees, do a bit of landscaping around it, and have it a nice amenity feature on the farm as well as just a biodiversity feature. Maybe we don't need that. Maybe we just put in dig a hole and let it fill with water, which it will in that area. But there's a cost involved in that. Am I supposed to do that? It does no monetary gain for me from a farming point of view, or does the likes of the government help with supports to do that if we want biodiversity gain on the farmland and in the countryside? So I can't see how people that want to improve biodiversity and want to improve nature, they don't seem to want to engage with farmers. And we need to improve on that in the IFA as well, and we're very well aware of that now, that as we move towards nature restoration, as there's a biodiversity climate fund, we need to engage properly with that process and with the nature restoration process to make sure that we look for the right things, and we try and get the right things, and we try and get the right supports in place to make those happen, but alongside productive farming rather than instead of productive farming. And some of the messages coming from nature restoration law in the beginning would have said that there will be no more roads built in certain areas, no more houses built in certain areas. And if you have a farm family, there might be the son going to farm, there might be a daughter going to farm, there might be another sibling that wants to build a house on the farm to feel an attachment to the area. It could be at the edge of a village, but they have ground and they have a site, and they might have, my sister has a house on the farm, my brother is up the road from the farm, and we were hearing that that was going to be outlawed, that there wasn't going to be any more development in certain areas. So obviously alarm bells go off. You're talking about re-wetting ground, re-wetting farmland, as well as government ground or board and mono ground or semi-state ground. So there's a lot of misinformation out there. There was a lot of people given a false story of what was going to happen. There was no economic impact assessment done on it for rural Ireland or for farmers. There was no budget in place for it to make it happen. So farmers get very nervous then, because there has been other schemes that haven't worked out for farmers financially, where ground has been made less productive in some areas. I think you have to apply to the government to reseed the ground, and it could take 2 years to get a reply from them. Obviously they just don't want you doing it, so they'll just put your file to the back. And if you want to make, I think there was 30 different measures, that if you wanted to do any of those measures on your block of ground in areas of conservation, that you'd have to apply to be allowed to do any of those measures, where I can go out and reseed a field here now. So the control of the ground and the rights and the property rights of the farmer are taken away in certain circumstances. And we'd like farmers, within reason, within planning guidelines, and to be able to decide what they want to do with their own ground, rather than having everything dictated to them from Europe or from government, in a controlled way.
Yeah. So again, now I'm going to say this. There's a lot of in your answer here, right? So the first thing that you folks might see in the video, that where you were showing me the area where you want to dig up the pond, and my question was like, so will the nature restoration law be potentially helpful in getting funds for that? And then you said like, yes, right? So
possibly.
So there is a possibility.
Yeah.
Now on the building houses front, my observation is that, again, folks who are sitting, they living in their, semi-urban life, they go like, well, you cannot build houses everywhere and so on. But what struck me is like, your family is here for like 400 years.
Yeah.
Right? So you see this thing quite differently from the perspective like, oh, I cannot now, like, so my family now is some sort of limited in continuing that, making life here, because you cannot build a house on your own. So I understand this more, and I think that this is hard to understand for folks who sort of don't have that experience. Like I have that. Like to me, it was like, wow, you mean your family's 400 years here? It's awesome. So I think what I'm trying to say is, I can understand how people like you would be worried about limits on building road and building house.
Just for instance, I came home to farm 25 years ago, probably now, Tommy, and it was probably 15 or 16 years ago, we built this house here. So I was living in town with my girlfriend at the time, my wife now, and we would have looked for planning permission and got planning permission for the house and built a house on the farm. I spent 2 or 3 years driving from Kilkenny, which is only, it's 15 minutes away. It was exactly 15 minutes to get out of the house in town and to get to the calving box when a cow was calving. I had the camera, I was able to see what was happening. I could ring my dad inside, who was in his 60s at the time, and I'd come home myself quicker and do it myself and go back into town. So we needed to move out here because the farm business is here. My wife is teaching up the road, so we got planning permission. There is a risk that if you're not allowed to get planning permission in certain areas, and we'd probably be okay here, right? But there is other farmers who wouldn't be. My sister would have liked to have built a house here, so she looked for planning permission, got planning permission in the next field, and she's living here as well. And it's great having them there. The two families mix very well. All the kids are similar ages and all that, and they can pop down to my parents. So that's part of the community here. They're joined the hurling club where we all grew up and went to local schools and that. So that's what it is to be part of the community. And some people don't have the opportunity for that, or maybe don't. They probably understand it. A lot of people in Ireland aren't that far removed from the farm. But I wouldn't like to have that opportunity taken away from the next generation here or the next generation on other farms around the country, if within proper guidelines and everything else, if they can get planning permission and everything else. But in some cases, that could be taken out of their hands with nature restoration.
So there's another thing about nature restoration law that I don't want to say that I'm going to challenge you, but I'm going to ask you about. So in the law, there is that the productive agricultural land will not be taken away, right?
Yeah.
That's in the law. So it's not like a government will come out and interpret the law differently. And you mentioned there was like a lot of misinformation and like a little bit of a scaremongering around that. You said that but that there was no plan made by the government and so on. And for example, before the elections, I was talking with the Sinn Féin representatives, not on a podcast, but privately. And they said like, we blocked nature restoration law because there was no plan by the government how to implement it.
Yeah.
And my answer was, well, why would it be planned if it wasn't passed yet?
Yes.
Why would government spend time and resources making plan for something that wasn't even passed yet? So now you voting against it, you just proven the government right that they haven't prepared for it because you just voted against it.
We never got an opportunity to vote on it either way. But in lobbying for people to vote against it, and that would have meant it would go away. Look, I think we'll end up with the nature restoration law or without the nature restoration law. We would have arrived at a situation where we were going to work on biodiversity. We were going to work on a certain amount of nature restoration within the country anyway. I think the Green Party are very happy that one of the last things Eamon Ryan did in government was to go around to other leaders in Europe and encourage them to vote for nature restoration law. And I think it was an Austrian Green minister that maybe went against the government.
I think that some region, what I heard about it, that some region of Austria changed their mind in the last minute.
Some individual in Austria might have gone against the government decision and voted themselves. But that has become law.
It was different. I think it was different that within Austria, that she could vote for it only if certain percentage of like a regions in Austria was for it.
Okay.
And then one of these guys like flipped their decision last minute, and then because she saw that they flipped that decision, then she said like, okay, now I can vote for it. So technically it was okay, but it was kind of like that's what I heard. I didn't dig any deeper. Yeah, but it hinged on the Austrian vote on this.
So it's gone through, and we're not over enthusiastic about it, and the reason is the legacy issues, taking the autonomy away from farmers to decide what they want to do with their own land. And as you said, the law says that productive farmland will not be affected or will not be taken out of production. Who decides if it's productive? And then going back to the autonomy of decisions, you may still be able to farm it, but under what restrictions and what changes will you have to make? and at what cost.
Like on the
And whether
designated land, right?
Yeah, but is it a cost to your farming business, or will you have to make investments? Is there an actual capital cost, or is it an ongoing cost to your farming business? Do you have to reduce production? Yeah, same as the designated lands, that there is restrictions placed on those farmers now. And in theory, they're still allowed to do the same things with permissions, but they're finding it very difficult to get the permissions to do anything different.
Now, once the laws is passed, right, now there is an opportunity, like you said, to make something good out of it,
Yeah.
to make it positive. And like you mentioned, like we in Ireland would probably work for biodiversity as well. So why we don't see, or at least not, this is not the main narrative, as like, okay, it's passed, now let's make something good of it. Like it was almost like a preemptively being against that. And the thing that genuinely worried me, that I spoke with one of the farmers that I know, and I didn't get a satisfactory answer, was like, hey, look, like it seems like everybody is for it against farmers. Even corporations are saying like, yeah, we should do this. And only like, this is really bad optics. That bothered me.
Yeah,
that bothered me that the optics of it is, oh, the farmers are the bad guys, right? And so I just curious of your comments on this. Like, was there like a little bit of like a preemptive saying no because that might be something bad? I was like, well, it might be something good as well.
There might be something good. It's like saying that it's the old story of the chicken being involved in the breakfast, but the pig is fairly committed to it. It's all right. It's fine for anybody else to say they're for nature restoration law, but we're the guys that are going to have to take the hit or to implement it, or whatever way you want to look at it. Now there's an opportunity. Look at it, it's coming in. Budget needs to be put in place for it, and we need to be involved in that process as to what it's going to be used for. I gave you the example of the pond because I'm pretty sure that if I was building a car park inside in town and employed for a biodiversity part, which would be maybe putting some wildflowers and a couple of trees around the car park, I'd get 100% funding for that inside in town, right?
But you're still building a car park.
Yeah. It's not, look, it's a very small thing that you're doing for biodiversity inside in an urban area where there isn't much biodiversity anyway, right? I'm out on a farm with a lot of biodiversity and we'll improve it, but there's no fund for me to do that. So when we hear that there's a climate and biodiversity fund being created by the government and it's to be 3.15 billion, and then there's another fund being created that's 2 billion a year over 7 years, which is 14 billion, we've had no assurances that that's going to be directed at agriculture. And we have the situation now, right? If I go out and plant a tree today, I do not get any of the carbon sequestration credits on my farm. So I can't offset the emissions from my farm with the tree that I plant on my farm. If I put solar panels on the roof of my shed, the reduction in emissions goes to the energy sector rather than to the agriculture sector.
That's crazy.
Yeah. The planting the tree goes to LUCF, not to agriculture. Now there's some trade-offs in that as well. All green diesel that's burnt goes straight into agriculture. So if we reduce the green diesel that we're using somehow or other by some of these measures, then we reduce the emissions from agriculture by burning less green diesel. It's very, very tricky, and farmers have been left on the back foot the whole time on this. Take oil, for instance, and it's a basic one. If you burn oil in Ireland, it's dug out of the ground in Saudi Arabia or somewhere. If we burn it here, the emissions are counted in Ireland. If we produce milk here, the emissions are produced here. If we sell it to Saudi Arabia, the emissions for the milk production are staying here, not going to Saudi Arabia. So there's a ludicrous situation there. When we produce something, the emissions are here, but when they produce something, the emissions are also here. So we've seen lots of different things like this where it's very unfair calculations and practices out there. So it's very hard to have confidence that there will be a budget and farmers will not be, I suppose, affected in the cost of doing their business, and maybe costs imposed on their business by it without the proper supports in place to meet those costs. And farmers will be left worse off and less viable. And there's already a huge percentage of farmers in a vulnerable place as regards to the amount of income that comes into the farms. They're not in a hugely profitable place. A lot of them have off-farm jobs. Spouses have off-farm jobs to keep the farm going. It's a way of life. They're very happy doing it. But you take another step back with more costs being imposed on us, and suddenly you see a generation of farmers not coming home to farm, not building a house on a farm, not buying a few cattle or keeping a few cattle, or not being attached to the land anymore. And maybe that's what people want, but those people maybe move to urban areas or emigrate or do whatever they do. The schools have less kids in them, the hurling clubs and the GAA clubs and local sports clubs have less in them, and the social fabric changes. and the impact assessment hasn't been done on that at European or at Irish level yet. And we're saying that needs to be done, as well as the economic impact assessment, and not just assess. Obviously, if you're going to restore nature, you're going to have a boost in the environmental impact.
My thought when you said that, my thought was like, on the one hand, you can say like, okay, yeah, but we need to reduce emissions anyway. But the other thing is like, yeah, like you said, those people, instead of staying in farming, they will go and work for Microsoft and Amazon in Saudi Arabia.
And push up the emissions again. Look, we were told we were going to have to reduce emissions in agriculture. And we said, fine, we'll plant more trees, that'll take out the emission. No, that won't work, lads. We'll put up solar panels and we'll reduce. No, that won't work, lads. And what do we have to do is reduce cow numbers, or find something that reduces the amount of methane that the cows produce. We can put in the multi-species sward and buy less fertiliser, and that's a win. But it's very difficult to get wins at it. It's very difficult to reduce emissions if you're not able to get the sequestration credits or whatever other measures you take, if the credits aren't being attributed to agriculture and to your farm. We're doing, like farmers are doing the bulk of the carbon sequestration for the whole country, for the whole economy, and get no credit for it. And that's a very difficult situation to be in, and we're told we're still probably 2 or 3 years away from having the calculation on as to what sequestration is going on in our hedgerows, in our trees, or in our mineral soils with permanent grassland on them that's not being ploughed. We need to get those calculations on. We need to get farmers credit for those, and then we can move forward more positively with the environmental lobbyists, whatever you want to call it, and get a plan in place for where we go forward. But we're being left back the whole time. That's in a lot of cases, and not getting the credits that we should be getting up to now. And that's why there's always a little bit of worry when something new comes on and people say nature restoration, this is going to be X, Y and Z more actions that you have to take. Back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, we were paid there was a cap budget there, and it was paid to farmers to support food production. So they wanted food security, they wanted food to be produced. They gave grants to clear ground, and they gave farmers a subsidy to subsidise the cost of production for beef and grain, etc. And now those payments are being used for environmental measures. About 40 to 50% of the payments are probably going for environmental measures now. So the cap budget is still there. It's been reduced, and then a lot of individual farms have had their cap payments hugely reduced by levelling the payments across the country. So it's another case where I suppose it's like the frog going into the boiling water. The water is slowly being turned up, that we're being moved over to environmental measures the whole time with our money. And if you told the farmers in the early 90s that half the money was going to be literally halved on some farms, and half that money was going to be coming from environmental measures rather than supporting production, they'd probably have shot you at the gate. But that's where we've arrived at now. That's the reality, that farmers are already having to jump through a huge amount of environmental hoops to get payments that were there to subsidise food production, but they're still producing that food. And food security has been forgotten about. A lot of people that develop policy and that, as I say, they've never been hungry a day in their lives. Yeah, you just wonder if they're the right people to be developing policy around food production, which is what farmers do. We produce food. Every time you sit down at a table, you're eating something that's been produced on a farm. There's different people looking for us to eat different diets and change diets and reduce consumption of etc., but it's all actually produced on farm.
Yeah, and on the policy, how policy is made, that's probably material for an entire different episode, because I have my own let's say problems with how the policy is being made, and also attitude of policymakers towards, for example, scientific findings, let's say that way. I'm going to ask you another question that sort of like a common, I don't want to use the word narrative, but a common thing that you hear, and then like a perception that I also have, is that farming is being perceived as very powerful lobby. You mentioned you're going to be lobbying, and they're a very powerful lobby. They're getting what they want really eventually. If stuff doesn't work, then there are farmers going out with the tractors blocking stuff, and they're getting what they want almost all the time. They're very powerful. Yet when you speak with farmers, like I do, like I speak with you, you have this feeling like uncertainty. What's the future? Like fear even about the future, and we always the guys who are getting beat up with something. Help me and our listeners and viewers to reconcile these two opposing perceptions of farmers? Are they very strong and getting what they want most of the time, or are they ones that are being oppressed all the time?
Well, we do a lot of lobbying. We're the second highest group. We record all our lobbying. We're probably particularly good at it. We have a good level of staff in the farm centre, and anytime we meet a politician, we have to report that. So we're probably particularly good at doing that and ticking that box. So we do a fair amount of lobbying. We do get good access. It's a rural country. The Taoiseach is from Wicklow now rather than Dublin. Maybe that'll be a help to us in lobbying, that he has more constituents in rural areas now. Yeah, we do. Do we do it as effectively as we'd like? If you were speaking to farmers, they would say no. And that's all farm organisations get challenged. There's been a lot of challenges to the IFA and the job that we do over the last 10 years. Maybe there's been other different organisations set up to go different directions, saying that we weren't doing enough. So, yeah, the view from outside of ag probably that we're doing a lot and doing it well. And look, part of it is my responsibility, so I'd like to think we're doing it as well as we can. But we don't get everything we look for, Tommy. Definitely not. Like we look for the proper supports to maintain incomes on farm and to keep people on farm. And we also look for tax incentives for doing things like slurry storage. For young people coming home to farm, they do get, same as you get business relief, you get agriculture relief, so you get the farmers reduced in value before the tax implications are calculated. So we do get incentives there for young people to come home to farm. We do get grants, but they're usually around environmental measures now, like the LESS, the lower emission slurry spreading equipment that reduces emissions into the environment, on slurry storage, and then some modernisation of farms that also reduce emissions but improve farm productivity and profitability. And productivity is often a bad word now. It's probably more productive or more sustainable production is what we're looking at now. We're looking at just multi-species swards and red clover swards kind of grants as well to help put the establishment of them, and again moving us in an environmental direction. There's grants to plant hedges and plant trees now as well. So there is some incentives to do the right thing by the environment and to do the right thing in farming. We've lobbied effectively for some of those things. If we meet the minister, I'll say to him straight, that's working very well. We're very happy with that. We'd like this to work a little bit differently, and we'd like to go a different direction with something else. And he listens to it all, but he doesn't act on it all, definitely. And the Minister for Finance definitely doesn't act on it all. We've an issue there with residential zoned land tax, where farming that is zoned on the edge of cities is subject to a 3% tax next February. And we're lobbying for the last 2 years to try and get that abolished, and it hasn't happened yet. And while the political parties say they want to sort it out, effectively there's people facing 10, 20, 30, 40, 50,000 euros of a tax bill in February just to stay farming the ground that they've owned for generations. It just happens to be on the edge of a town where a local authority has zoned it and their services available. So no, we don't get everything we want. We try and lobby as effectively as possible, and we are a lobby organisation. That's what we do to a large extent. We represent farmers. We actually do a lot of other jobs as well, I suppose, besides that, but we'll continue to do the best we can. But we definitely don't get everything we want, and if we did, we wouldn't protest as much. And we haven't been doing as much protesting as people might think lately. We had our Enough is Enough campaign, where we didn't disrupt anybody going through their daily business. But we are exploring, if the likes of the residential zoned land tax isn't sorted out, there's going to be farmers put on the street over that. That's the reality. They're going to be put off their family farms with the cost of that tax. The tax in some cases is multiples of the income on the farm. 3-4 times the full income of the farm. So it's not, they'd have to sell off the ground and there's actually nobody there to buy it. It's a ridiculous situation. But we'll probably get that sorted, but we may have to protest on that towards the end of the year. It wasn't sorted out in last year's budget. It was kicked out for 12 months, which meant another 12 months of stress on farm families and cost of putting in applications to get it taken out again and being refused again and go to a board. So there's a lot of different things like that we're working on at the moment. We have a 40-page document of stuff that we're looking for. Them. We didn't get 2 or 3 pages worth last year in the budget. So that's the reality. We have to look for certain supports for certain sectors at certain times. The tillage sector is on its knees at the moment, and potato farmers have a lot of potatoes left in the ground over the bad weather, like potatoes rotting in the ground, tens of thousands of euros, and we'd feel those farmers need to be supported or they'll be gone out of business. So
No, and you're right. One of the arguments that convinced me the most about why farmers were not so stoked about nature restoration law was the uncertainty aspect of it, right? And I think folks, you're listening to that, like the worst thing is like when you're uncertain what's gonna happen, it just messes with your mind. And that was probably the argument that I heard only recently, but then, well, in a sense, it was inevitable in how the whole thing was constructed. But I understand, like, with the history of not so favorable to farmers implementation of certain things, and now we have this big thing that is called the law, and you don't really know what that is. You say like, oh, how this is good. So there is an element of like, let's try to look at the positives and let's try to look at the opportunities rather that it's going to be bad. But then also you have a history and you sort of anxious what's going to happen. And I heard a farmer who was very pro nature restoration law, and he was talking on the podcast, and then he said something like, well, I don't know myself what I'm agreeing to, which was like, that's probably the...
Yeah, and the first iteration of the nature restoration law was a lot different from what we ended up with. So there was a bit of dilution of what was in it. And
the rewetting was cut in half.
Yeah. So, and that was a big issue for some of Irish farmers, but also some of our European counterparts in certain areas where there was a lot of peat soils and that, and they were very worried about nature restoration and those. And you see, this is the thing. People think, I've heard people, I suppose environmentalists say, oh, you can bring the water table up to within 30 centimetres of the surface of the field.
Yeah.
And I've been out to Holland and I've seen where that is done.
Yeah. And then the ground firms up so you can actually graze the cattle that you couldn't otherwise.
That's fine if the ground is level like that island there. So the ground in Holland, in places that has been reclaimed out of sea, it's all dead level. I've been in places in New Zealand where it was set up for irrigation, border dike irrigation, so the whole ground was contoured and done properly. Farmers, that ground out there, this area is called Clara. It's flat land, that's what it's called. But if you bring the ground over there, which is 50 metres higher than where we are, within 30 centimetres off the top, where is the water here? So it doesn't work unless the ground is dead level. And this is the thing people don't understand. In some of the bigger bogs, the Bordemona bogs, maybe something like that is possible, but once you go outside of that, ground contours. And unless you really control that, and you're talking just rewriting the whole thing and just wiping out all the biodiversity that's there now and starting again. Like, I don't see how you do it. Now, that's just my practical mind, and a lot of farmers maybe would think similar to that on a page in a book, yeah, maybe it'll work, but out in the Irish countryside, it might not work as easily as that.
Local.
Yeah, it'll work in a very small percentage of areas, very, very small percentage of areas where you have an absolutely flat plane of ground that you could bring a large area within 30 centimetres of the surface without creating ponds and lakes everywhere.
Well, that's a good point. I want to switch gears a little bit and ask you about another thing. Do you really think, again, something that is heard quite often, that the farmers at this point are sort of locked into the system that is not favorable? That for the longest time, farmers were very good at doing what they were told by the government. You do this, you intensify, you have a bigger tractor.
They were incentivized to do it, yeah.
Right, they were incentivized, so they were doing all those things. And now it's for government, on one hand, on the government is like a shift, like, oh, now we're doing something else. And then farmers are locked, like this is this phrase, locked into the system of the subsidies, of the, some of them are in debt. And is that your view on this, that the history made farmers to be where they are right now, not of their own fault, but because they were doing what they told, really, by government, by farming organizations, etc.?
Yeah, well, I suppose the economics usually dictate what somebody does. Not always, but the economics. And when you're incentivized through economics to go down a certain system of production, then yeah, you're going down that route. You could be talking about headage payments going back for keeping cattle or bulls, and people got into that system. They made the investments around that. They were paid their payments from Europe through CAP for doing that. So that's the way the farm is now set up. So the dearest thing you can do in a farm is change your enterprise. So to change from beef to dairy costs a lot of money. To change from beef to tillage or from tillage to dairy, they all cost a lot of money because the investments that you have on a farm aren't suitable for the new enterprise in a lot of cases. You can repurpose some buildings at a smaller cost if you're going from beef to dairy, but if you're going from tillage to dairy, largely you're just building a new dairy unit, for example. And the same from going from dairy back to tillage, you're just writing off the investment that you had in any dairy facilities that were on the farm. So yeah, you've people that are gone down a certain route, it's very hard to do a complete U-turn and come out of it. If you want to go down the organics route, you're destocking the farm to an extent and you're changing your system. You have to plant clover. There's an investment. There is grants to support it. There is a big investment piece. You're immediately moving to a lower production and a lower output figure. So it depends on what your commitments are from previously. Do you need a certain level of output to meet your commitments to the banks or for our family living or whatever else? You can't probably farm organically at any scale on rented land because the rental charge would be most of your profit, or if not all of your profit. So if we wanted to produce milk on a leased farm, and if we want to produce organic milk on it, your stocking rate is limited through organics. Your rental stays the same, but your output per hectare isn't enough to cover the rental as well as the other costs of production. So it's not always easy to change your system of production or your enterprise if you wanted to change to a different enterprise. Farmers can be incentivized to do that and supported to do that. But again, some people do what they're doing because they like doing what they're doing or it suits them. Somebody that's working off farm and has a few suckler cows, if he's going to go full-time dairy farming, he has to give up a job and make a huge investment and then try and pay back the investment without his job maybe, or else make it work somehow or other part-time. So it's not always easy. Farmers were incentivized to go certain routes years ago. If you're incentivized to take out a hedge, for example, there is grants now for putting them back, so there is incentives for putting them back. But it's taking ground out of production then to put back the hedge or to put back.
Yeah, but my point is like this is the ridiculousness of the situation. Now you pay to take out the hedge, and then like no. Now we're gonna pay you to put back the hedge. And it's like
in 30 years' time, Tommy, we could be in the ridiculous situation where the world is short of food, and people say, but they actually wanted people to take out farms and go back to nature or to flood farms or to plant ground or whatever, or put solar panels on very good productive land. You know, we could be in that situation. In Ireland, with our sunlight, people are putting solar panels on very good productive land. And I mean, if you ever fly over Spain, you'll see the amount of daylight hours there, and they're flying over parts of it that are deserts. And to me, that's where you put the solar panels, and you can keep producing the food here. But that's
the thing that I say is like there's no biodiversity under solar panels.
Yeah, but they do produce energy, and they take that renewable energy box that other enterprises or other sectors want to be able to buy renewable energy to tick that box and to reduce their carbon emissions through using renewable energy. So, but you take ground out of agricultural production. And in Ireland, we have no rules around what type of ground you can take out. In the UK even, they have rules saying that only grade 3 farmland can go under solar panels, which is just lower quality ground. It's not as productive. But here we're taking productive agriculture out and putting in solar panels.
But my point is like, even if you talk about biodiversity, there's no biodiversity under solar panels either way. Yeah, like energy is like, again, probably another episode of the podcast. Like we always go in these rabbit holes. Do you share the opinion that to move forward, because like what I mean by move forward, like we touch on many things right now which are really contentious, right? Like it's sort of like a point on which a lot of conversation is hinging, and a lot of that conversation is, let's say, not civil, it's just a shouting match. So we touch on a number of these points. Do you think that to be able to move forward, there needs to be a moment of like reconciliation and saying like, hey, yes, this is the situation we're in, and this is why, because all that you mentioned, and let's all acknowledge that, both farmers and environmental like, again, it's hard to say that because farmers, there are like so many different types of farmers, and same like say environmentalists, right? I'm a hunter and angler, but I would consider myself radical environmentalist. But using those umbrella terms, do you think that it needs to be like a reconciliation of the situations we're in now in order to move forward? Because otherwise we always going to be bogged down by, how we get there, this is your fault, no, this is your fault, this is what it happened, this is what it is, we all agree on that, let's move forward.
Yeah, well, that's why I'd like to see the farm organisations maybe coming to the table in a more proactive and positive way, and look at maybe there's opportunities with nature restoration. We have to be very careful still, but we need to maybe move the thing forward and start coming up with something constructive that we can say, right, our farmers are going to be looked after. If they're expected to do this, they'll be supported in this way, right? So we need to move the thing forward. Does there need to be reconciliation? I don't know. It's like science develops the whole time, and the narrative will develop the whole time. And I think it's business for us. It's opinion for a lot of people. It's business for us. So we need to make sure that we get it right from a business point of view. And it's going back to the chicken and the pig. We're the pig. We're very committed to the land and to nature restoration. We need to make sure that is done properly.
Chicken is only involved party.
Yeah, it's only involved supplying the egg. That's all it is. So, and supplying an opinion a lot of the time. Whereas to us, it's our livelihood. And it is business, So we need to make sure that it's done right. So do we need to reconcile with... We need to move forward. Everybody needs to move on from having arguments about it. We need to improve the biodiversity. We need to improve water quality. And we just need to improve nature in general out there. We realise that. We realise it as much as anyone. We're farming out here. We can see what weather patterns are coming at us every day outside. We're not climate change deniers or anything like that. I don't think anybody that's farmed in Ireland over the last 12 months would deny that it's changed, or it's developing, or something has changed. Now, I'd still say that as the climate changes, we're probably best placed in Ireland to produce the likes of beef and dairy. Now, some people say we should reduce that, but I'd say there's still a huge demand. So I say I don't ever see anybody walking out of a nightclub at 2 a.m. looking to go eat a vegan burger, and that's in vino veritas. People eat meat. The Euros are on at the moment. There's a huge demand for beef burgers. And people want to eat something quickly and keep going. So I would say we'll supply that as well as anyone. We'll supply it as carbon efficiently as anyone. We don't have to take out rainforests or anything like that to do it. People will argue that there's feed imported from some of those countries like soybean and that. I think we need to maybe get that piece right and use more native grain. And we need to find the balance on how many stock we want to carry in the country and what we want to do. But there's a lot of jobs and a lot of livelihoods and a lot of rural towns that depend on the cow, whether that's the beef cow or the dairy cow, or the tillage farmer or the sheep farmer or the pig farmer to make a living. And I don't think, the people in rural Ireland don't want to see that change, right? And we hear a lot of negative stuff on social media, and I would say it's probably from a very, very small percentage of people.
We should all log off social media for 12 months. That would improve things.
Then we wouldn't have to reconcile or anything. We just get on with our lives.
Look, you mentioned we don't have to take a rainforest, and many people would make an argument that the rainforest was already taken out in Ireland. That's and we should focus on now putting it back on. Now, what do you think? So in that vein, what do you think are the biggest obstacles and the biggest difficulties in nature restoration, in taking off with improving biodiversity? Because some of my feeling, and you may challenge that opinion, I'm happy to that, but my opinion is when I hear people doing things, they digging up a pond, or leaving the corner of the farm on the farm, but there's a meadow, and I don't want to diminish the value of that, but at the same time I have a feeling this is just a tipping around the edge. It's just a drop in the ocean of what's really needed to have a meaningful restoration of the nature and habitats and so on. What do you think about that, and what do you think are the biggest obstacles or biggest barriers?
Okay, so take forestry for example, right? And it's very difficult to get planning permission from forestry, or planning permission for clear felling or putting in roads, the whole forestry area. It wouldn't be polite to say what it is at the moment. Okay, we've had a Green Minister in charge of that, so that should have been moving forward, and it hasn't moved forward at all. It's probably regressed in a lot of ways, and there's very few farmers applying to plant trees at the moment. We're nowhere near meeting our targets on that, be it climate change or just land use. Okay, so my view is Sitka spruce is the only thing that pays in a forestry point of view. The Greens don't want it. I'm not arguing with them. I'm not particularly in love with Sitka spruce. There's no biodiversity under it, and it has water quality issues as well, right? But it's the only thing that's making money for forestry owners and farmers that are doing forestry in Ireland. It's the only thing that they can see a return for within their lifetime. So if they put in a native broadleafed woodland, and we need to come up with a native woodland scheme, it needs to be a broadleaf woodland scheme. It needs to be over a long period of time, and carbon sequestration needs to be built into it with actual realistic income. So a good grant for establishment at the start, and payments similar to forestry payments. If we want to incentivise people within trees, the payments have to be fairly strong on that for the first 20, 25 years. And at some stage, a serious carbon sequestration payment needs to kick in and be paid back to the landowner to incentivise them to put it in, that there is an actual income in it for generations. Otherwise, he puts in broadleaf woodland, gets payments on it for 25 years, and then it sits there. And it doesn't return anything to him. And he can't, even if he cuts all the trees out of it, he has to go and replant it again. Or she, or they, or whatever has to replant it again. And they're putting a noose around the future generation's neck that they can't do anything with that ground. That ground is eventually sterilised or devalued or whatever else it is, because there is no economic value in it for maybe 100 years, which is kicking it on down the generations. And that makes it very difficult. Whereas if there's an actual financial incentive for somebody to put in a broadleafed native plantation and there's a return from it over generations, then I think you'll see that happening. So if we really wanted to get serious in nature restoration, that's one place we should be starting. But we've had a Green Minister in there for 5 years, there's nothing happened.
And what are your views on incentivizing farmers for, let's say, permanent habitat restoration, right? So I'm talking about things, I have my own opinions on that, but I'm going to throw it out that, for example, tourism, right? One thing, or some other sort of payments that are not necessarily tied to extractive aspect of it. Like, it's a broadleaf woodland, but at some point you counting on making, timber or something. What about, saying like, hey, is it even possible in your view to have a program where we can do like a landscape scale restoration, and at the same time that pieces of this landscape are owned by farmers, landowners, who are incentivized to have those habitats, those wildlife corridors, there's whatever that is, not necessarily on the from the perspective of the extractive economy. Is that possible?
So you use two terms, farmers and landowners. And if somebody puts solar panels on their land, they're still landowners, but they're no longer farming to all intents and purposes. And if somebody plants a woodland on their farm, they are a landowner still, but they're no longer farming. It's not saying they couldn't be doing something on the land, but we saw an oak tree today that was planted 25 years ago. It was probably 6 or 8 feet tall at the time. It's probably 20 feet tall now, but it's a long way away from any commercial gain to be got from that tree. So if you talk about planting a woodland now and somebody making an income from that woodland for the next 20 years, no, not unless it's Sitka spruce being tinned or something like that. Like, that's probably the commercial reality of it. So what you could have is a lot of people living in those woodlands working remotely or whatever they're doing, or you could have people owning the land and living in anywhere around the world and taking whatever income is there from that land for forestry or for whatever else. So can it happen on a landscape scale? It can, but the rural community will more than likely look different from what it does now, because if there's 10 suckler cows on the block of ground, somebody has to turn up every day and look after them. There's somebody attached to them. There's somebody living there. There's probably a family living there that could be both working off farm as well. But, that's the reality. Even though farmers are aging and aging out in a lot of cases, but there is some young person in line that might have one or two cattle or be attached to it or given a hand at the weekend or involved in some way and probably going to follow through after them, even if it's when they retire, there will be somebody there afterwards. So to me, it probably changes the rural fabric of society. You don't have the factories killing the cattle anymore, you don't have the factories processing the milk anymore, and you don't have the same level of income, even if it isn't all profit, but the same level of turnover of income in the rural community as you do if there's an active farming enterprise going on in the same ground. So I'm not saying which is right and which is wrong, but I'm just saying we have to be prepared for huge change. So if you wanted to change that landscape and take out the 10,000 cows that are out there, what will the people do? Because there's a certain amount of them can look after tourism, but that's probably limited.
So did I get that right? That effectively you're talking that then this land will be purchased by some rich asshole who doesn't even live in the area.
Well, the government effectively purchases land with forestry premiums over 25 years. And the land has to be re-put back into forestry afterwards. So there's a farmer there getting an income and he gets a clear felling and then he goes and puts trees in it again. It's effectively purchased over a period of time as well. I'm not saying the government are assholes, but yeah, you could have somebody coming in from in a corporate structure looking to offset their carbon credits, and they could buy the ground and grow the trees, or they could pay the carbon credits to the farmer or the landowner. Sorry, and this is the semantics of it. You're moving towards a landowner rather than a farmer, and the farmer is attached to the land, whereas the landowner doesn't have to be.
So what I'm getting from you, if anyone wants to implement that in the correct way, the rules needs to ensure, at least enable people to stay where they are, and kind of the community will change and the land use will change, but the community will still be there and the people still be there. Well,
I'd like to see that. A lot of people in rural Ireland would like to see that. Like, we coach under 12 camogie team and under 14 hurling team over the pitch, and we barely have a team. We have a team. We have a couple of subs when we go out to hurl and go out to play camogie. But yeah, if you go into rural areas and you take away the attachment and the reason for somebody to have to be there, whether it's to look after stock or to do a bit of work or maintenance or whatever it is, what do you replace it with? So you can replace it with working remotely now. We see more people doing that, and that's fine, and that will work in certain circumstances. But yeah, you're just at risk of it will change. So what does change look like? And change isn't always bad. And okay, maybe it can be a good thing. People travel further to central locations for their community rather than having the community in smaller areas more spread out. So I don't know. We're close enough to Kilkenny city, so maybe if there was less animals being looked after and the area was planted here, maybe we'd still live here and shuttle in and out of town a bit more, and there wouldn't be as much of a community hub locally, for instance. So it's just change, and see, the impact assessment has to be done on that before nature restoration. It will have to be done anyway by the Irish government. So your sustainability, your social, economic and environmental, but the environmental, that's what I said, is done. The economics will be done. We'll see what it'll cost and see what impact it'll have. But the social side needs to be looked at as well, and see what the rural community looks like. And I'd be passionate enough about it. And it's hard enough probably for teams in the likes of over the west coast, over Mayo and Galway and Kerry, Roscommon, all those places, to keep young people in the community, keep them involved in sport and all that. So I think you're putting more challenges in place for that. And then you have to see what that's going to look like going forward.
No, and I guess I'm going to come back to this, that your view on this is quite different because you're here for 400 years, your family, and that's quite different attachment to the area and to which I can't even begin to think. It's sort of this back to these like two types of people, somewheres and anywheres, and that is apparently the real division in the society, not between rural and urban or anything like that, which is to your point. If you had a magic wand, like now we're going into the famous magic wand question, right? And if you had a magic wand in terms of how nature restoration law will be implemented in Ireland, right? If you can give like a 3 points, let's say, that in your view then that would be beneficial for farmers, for rural communities, but also for biodiversity, meet the targets, improve the biodiversity, get some, red listed species improving, curlew and so on? Like, what are the 3 points that you would implement, or at least look at? Or maybe those are not 3 points, maybe just a process that you would start. So how would that look like?
Yeah, well, I suppose the red listed species, probably just targeted measures at those, like the hen harrier project, and have a corncrake project, and try and get farmers on board and really support farmers to work in certain areas and providing the right habitat for those birds, and to take the right measures on their farms. And in some cases, make them the custodians of the environment, give them something to do, a reason to be there, and fit farming around whatever that is, but give them the proper supports to make that work. That's my view on the red listed species that we need to save and want to have in the country. So then what do we do on we'll say the more productive land over this side of the country? Put in an environmental budget separate to CAP to support farmers to make the proper investments on the farm, and to support the change of practice on farm to be more environmentally friendly, to grow more clover swards at the very least, or multi-species. Support the likes of agroforestry, where you have the trees, or silvopasture, whichever you want to call it, where you have more trees through the land. And that's not easy. That's a difficult and expensive thing to set up. It just isn't happening by means. No. So I'd like to see more trees on the countryside. I'd like to see supports in place for the biodiversity features, like ponds, or if there's an area going to be sown with berry bush, I call it a berry larder area, so an acre, just fully funded to be fenced and planted and looked after, but let somebody farm alongside that, and incentivize people maybe to go back and sow the hedges that were taken out years ago to break up the boundaries of fields, and to plant appropriate native trees along those, and put the fund in place to support it. The funds were put in place to take them out. We'll have to go again now and put the funds in place to put those back in again. And it really needs to be done like the ASAP programme for water quality, where it's targeted at individual farms. There's a plan drawn up for an individual farm, and these are the species in this region that we need to work on. This is what's on this farm. This is what we'd like to see on this farm, and this is what we'll have to do to get these species on the farm, and work with the farmers and be proactive and get the farmers on the ground and educate, and then say, this is what we want to do, and more importantly, this is why we want to do it, and this is how it's going to work. And I don't know whether that's 2 or 3 measures, Tommy, but that's what I'd like to see. The real red listed species, it has to be really targeted in the regions where there are corncrakes and you want more corncrakes. You expand that region out in radius, and then you really try and incentivize the farmers to do what's appropriate for that species to come back.
Look, one last thing that I want to leave our listeners and viewers with. I would ask you, how would you improve the discourse around farming, around nature, because there, we've been on Twitter, right? We've been on other social media, and we heard even in a typical classic mass media, legacy, like we call it, and it's getting nowhere, frankly. How would you improve? How would you, what to do to get people who are bashing heads with the, we had this conversation today when we were walking on the farm, that these are very complex problems. These are very complex communities. They are very complex things, and they're getting simplified and just compressed into the 280 character bytes. And then a lot of people, they don't know any better. They just repeating that, and that just escalates out of the proportion.
And there's a pile-on then when somebody comes in.
And what's worse, then because audience is used to these things, then some more prominent voices, let's say, they're grabbing onto these headlines and keep repeating that. And that is just getting us nowhere. How would you, I don't know, it's an open question, whether you would have any advice on how to engage with this sort of comments, or maybe you have some more broad words of wisdom, how to improve that discourse and get to the middle ground and common understanding and like some common plan rather than keep fighting.
Yeah, so I suppose we need to keep telling the good story on farm. So what are we doing well? And we need to keep showing what we're doing well and be realistic about it and be truthful about it as well. Like, but one thing we did say, we stood up on top of the hill up there today and you could see all the countryside, and there was trees and there was hedgerows everywhere, and then there was fields with just grass and very little hedges in them, and there was tillage farms and there was sheep farms and there was suckler farms. But you show the same picture to two people and they'll see something different and they'll see what they want to see. So I think it's about just being positive about what we're doing well, showing people what we're doing well, educating people on how to do things better. There's bad actors, and we discussed that as well. There's bad actors in every society, including agriculture. There's farmers doing the wrong thing. There's farmers spreading slurry when they shouldn't be spreading slurry, spreading too much or whatever else and causing issues, or not fencing stock out of water courses and creating issues there.
And they making headlines, right? It's like with the hunter who does something stupid, then they go like, oh, look at them.
Yeah, but some people criticize somebody that's actually doing the right thing. I think there was somebody took a video of somebody spreading slurry lately, and it's raining and he's spreading slurry. Well, that's fine if ground there's conditions are right, growing conditions are right, and it's not raining too much, then it's fine. It was only 10 mils of rain. So people's views, again, are different. Farmers looked at that and said, yeah, well, there's nothing wrong with that. And other people were looking at it going, oh, there's an issue. So there is still a lot of misinformation and fake news. You see tables put up and they're taken out of context, or they're trying to get the message, but they're using different figures to get it. But what do we do better? We do things better on farm. And we tell the story when we do things better on farm, and we show what's the right way to do things. But most of all, I suppose we're conscious of that in the IFA the whole time. There's more slurry storage needed. There's more better spreading equipment needed, and a lot of farmers still need supports to put that in place, and that will improve the situation, that people won't be under pressure to spread slurry at times of high rainfall and things like that, that they can wait until the rainfall is right and everything is right to do it. But that's it. There's some people, Tommy, though, no matter what you do, you'll never do enough for them. And like I said, you could show them that picture out there today, which we both would say that that's a nice patchwork of agricultural land, and they'll see it and say, oh, we want more. And if you put 10,000 trees out in the landscape, they'd still look at it and say, we want more. And sometimes they haven't looked like the community side as to what more actually means for the whole area, and so enough might never be enough for some people. And then you park that and you move on constructively with who is willing to engage constructively with you. And I think there's plenty of, we've caught people that are involved in environmental measures out there that are willing to come and talk to farmers and work with farmers and other landowners and everybody else, and try and get us all going in the right direction.
And I also think that there's a certain number of people who are just have too much baggage already, that the things are beyond repair almost, and I see that, like, not only in farming and in Ireland, but for example in the UK with the every controversy around the shooting. I think that some people on both sides, to be perfectly clear, just have too much baggage. They should disappear for like 5 years and then come back and start from scratch.
That's what the block button is for, Tommy. Sometimes you do nearly have to block, because some people do not want to see any animal agriculture, so they'll use the environmental argument to push back against animal agriculture. But even if you did everything they asked you to do for an environmental reason, they still wouldn't be happy with you farming cows, and that's the reality.
But that's the extreme views, right?
But they're out there, and there's plenty of them out there.
I know. But I think that by very definition, extreme views on both sides needs to be cut out because we're not gonna get anywhere.
And the likes of the farm organisations, we can't say no to everything. We have to say yes if we get it right, and if we can be involved in the process, then we'll look at that constructively and try and move it forward in a way that protects our farmers out there and protects our rural communities, which we also represent. So I think, sometimes we're guilty of saying, oh, that's like nature restoration, oh, that's terrible, we couldn't agree to that. Whereas we probably need to say, look, that needs to change, and it needs to be properly assessed, and its impact needs to be properly assessed. And then we need to see what changes need to be made after that, see what economics look like, see what budget needs to be put in place, and see if we're happy with what that'll look like in 20 years' time.
Bill, thank you so much for this conversation. I think our listeners and I learned a lot, and thanks for the invitation.
Thanks for coming to the farm, Tommy. Good to have you here.